Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we're going to be discussing, you know, one of the darker moments in Western history, really, because I guess we're going to be talking about the fall of Constantinople, which Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, which, fun fact, Istanbul means the city. That's what the name is. They took our beautiful, beautiful churches and they turned it into that. But no, we're gonna talk about it today. Very somber, very solemn subject to talk about. But in 1453 is when the fall of Constantinople. It's when the final nail in the coffin for the what would be known as the Roman Empire. Because you had the Roman Empire come up, it fell. The West fell. Well, it came up, split in two. The West fell, and then this is what we're talking about today. Is when the East fell. So that's what we're going to be getting into today. And we're talking about Constantinople. The reason it was called, the reason it was called Byzantium is because the city that was there before Constantinople was called Byzantium. And this is and where this city sits is, and I'll put a map up, but it sits on one peninsula to the other. So it's like one peninsula juts out, and then there's the Bosphorus Strait, which is a little thing of water, and then the next one. So it's like it's territorially, it's the best. It's one of the best like strategic positions you could build a city on. It's where the arguably the east meets the west. There's also the Nile, and you go down and stuff like that. But when you're going up and over into Eastern Europe and kind of Asia, the Anatolian Peninsula, there's two parts of the Byzantine Empire. You have like it's Eastern European one, where it owns the Eastern European side. Then there's Constantinople, and then it had the Anatolian heartland on the other side. So, and we're going to talk about Byzantium and how they got so big that they reconquered the whole entire Roman Empire. And these guys considered themselves Romans. They weren't, they didn't consider themselves Byzantians. They considered themselves Romans. So that's what we're going to cover today. So come along with me as we talk about, one of the worst chapters in human history, arguably. But let's get into it. When we're talking about Constantinople, I'm talking about the city in Eastern Europe that was the capital of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. It was founded in 330 AD by Constantine the Great. He wanted he wanted a source of power for that kind of side, and uh, so he founded the city and on what used to be Byzantium was a city called Byzantium and called it Constantinople. So, and from about 300 to about 1000 AD, they had like a 700-year golden era. They were kicking ass. You had Emperor Justinian. Well, you had Emperor Constantine, but like what he kind of set it up and everything. But really, like what's talked about a lot is Justinian and Belisarius. 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 Sorry. Belisarius, great Eastern Roman commander, general that doesn't get a lot of credit. I mean, nowadays, I think he's getting a lot more love and stuff, but he pretty much, Emperor Justinian was the one who ruled during this time, but the guy that reconquered all of Africa, kind of, that whole the Middle East into Africa, Egypt, and even up into Italy and the Italian heartland. I don't think they went over and reconquered Spain. Maybe parts of Spain, but I don't think they got that far. But they have reconquered pretty much that whole area by the 5 to 700. To then, that takes us kind of into the 900s, and well, you have like 700, 800s, and then the 900s, like one more note. We're just touching on the more notable aspects. This isn't going to be a super deep dive on Byzantium history because we could be here. That could be a 50-part series. So I'm just kind of touching on significant eras that happened till we got to the siege in the fall, because that's what we're talking about. But you got to know how they got so great to then know why the fall off was so bad. So we're in the 500s with Belisarius and Emperor Justinian, and they reconquer most of the empire, and then You have we're in the 900s with Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, very famous emperor that reconquered the Balkans and everything like that, and really cemented the borders of the empire, the Byzantium Empire. So, and this is where, eventually, and unfortunately, some would say it today is in today. There's a lot of parallels to where we're living today in America. And there's a lot of questions is the golden age really over in America? With everything that's going on, are we in the decline? And it's unfortunate when I think if you have to ask yourself that, you kind of know the answer. Unfortunately, but we still live in the best country in the world, and but lots of parallels you can be taken from this stuff. So that brings us to around 1071, and this is kind of the turning point, as some would say. This is the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The, this was in the Anatolian heartland. They go out to fight the Seljuk Turks to kind of get them to back off, and it's a disaster. It's a defeat. The emperor of the time, Emperor Romanos Diogenes the Fourth, probably Diogenes, yeah. Emperor Diogenes is captured, and I think he dies in captivity. Big L, that led to the loss of the whole Anatolian heartland. So when we were talking about the empire and stuff, Constantinople is on a kind of like it juts out on an island, and you have the Anatolian heartland, and you have like the Eastern European one. Well, they just lost. We're in 1071. They lose the whole Anatolian heartland, and they're kind of pushed right up to that. But they still have everything else, and but as things go on, the Seljuk Turks conquer more and more and more and more, and that brings us leading up to like the 12. This is kind of the thing that maybe they could have come back from that, but we have 1204, the Crusade, that they, on the way to Jerusalem, they stop and sack Byzantium. Very unfortunate, lost in the sauce. And this is the Fourth Crusade, and it kind of shows. It almost shows how anything can be corrupt given enough time, and it really takes vigilance to stay on things. That the First Crusade was amazing, great, retook Jerusalem, established all of the papal states or the Crusader states, but then it's like as each next crusade went on, it got more unjust, more political, and just, I mean, and they failed. More and more of them lost to the point to where, I mean, we don't own them today. Well, we gave Jerusalem back to we, yeah. So, but we have the Fourth Crusade in 1204, where they were supposed to go to Jerusalem, but they instead sack and destroy Byzantium, which is very. It's like damn, but they don't enslave everybody. They just take everything and burn it down. So, which it's but afterwards you still had Christian leaders and everything like that. Because as I was making this video and researching this, I was like, well, how's in 1204? Where's the fall? When is the fall? But the significance and difference is in 1204 they did that and left, which it kind of the Latin Empire was established under that and stuff, but they were Christians, so it was different, I guess. But so in 1453, that's when the big bad Muslims come knocking, and they finally take, and they tried to take Constantinople before this. There were other sieges, but they failed, and one of the big reasons they failed was because of the Theodosian walls, which we'll talk about. But why they were so kind of amazing for and really cutting edge for their time, and they really kept the wolves at bay for such a long time. But if you don't keep anything up to date, and as new technologies, like we'll talk about the big ass cannon basilica, as those things, gunpowder was invented or discovered. So as you have those things, that's what led to then the fall. But so in 1204, that's kind of the Fourth Crusade happens. They take and sack Byzantium. Then, in 1347, you have the Black Death, which is a plague, Yersinia pestis, plague that wipes out, I think half of the population or 60% of the population. Some huge number of the population dies in 1347. So they had just got sacked, and there's the death plague. Everybody dies. No, no, and in 1354, you have the fall of Gallipoli, which is in the European heartland. So up until this point, they kind of kept them at bay on in their own, in that part of the world. But as more and more time they crept up, they captured everything. They captured all around it, and then finally, with the fall of Gallipoli in 1354, they had that other foothold on the on the Eastern European side, so virtually circling Constantinople around. And I mean, at that point, you could consider them almost under siege, but nobody was trying to take the city for that, right? Because they were cutting everything off. The thing with why it was so hard to take the city is because you could get supplies in from this side or up here or down here from the water. So he had the Mehmed II had to cut off everything, then go after Constantinople, which he does, which that leads us into 1453. Mehmed II, um, he besieges in April, and that's the start of the end. That's the beginning of the end, so they say. So that's a quick timeline of how we got to where we are now at 1453, April 2nd, 1453. So April 1453, Seljuk Turks, Constantinople, Byzantium, two sides. I think we should take a second and stop here and discuss who the two sides were, what they were working with, kind of some interesting things about them. You had obviously the Byzantium, the defenders, and they were given opportunities to surrender. So they were sieged and besieged, but Mehmed II gave them the opportunity to just leave. Like you guys could just all leave now, but they chose to stand and fight and die, which is very honorable. No, you're not taking our city, even though it was sacked and things like that. But that was like 200 years ago. Very different. I don't know. Very courageous, which brings us to I mean, by this time, the Byzantium, they owned nothing, so they had no money coming in. It wasn't an empire. It was now just Constantinople, the state. With I think they had a few outer regions like near Greece and stuff that they owned, provinces or whatever there. But when they were besieged, obviously no help was getting in. And then at this time, it's like you would think that Rome would send help, but no help materialized for various reasons during the Crusades, the first ones, and every time the Crusaders were come through, and it's like, can you almost even blame them? But each time they came, yeah, can you blame? Because look what happened in the fourth one. But they were always very eerie about like just giving these guys free passage through their lands. They didn't send support a lot of times. There was a lot of times where they could have sent support to help the Crusaders. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Um, and there's when we talk about Orbo, this is a guy that he made this big cannon basilica that really does puts a pounding to the Theodosian walls. But a kind of fun fact about that is Orbo had approached the Emperor Genesis Diocletian and asked him, hey, I got this really crazy concept for this huge cannon. I need this amount of money to make it. Do you want to? And he said no. So the guy, Orbo, took his services to Mehmed II, and there's a lot of things we're going to talk about that really sealed their own fate. And it's like, man, makes you wonder. The little blunders don't they add up. Like, they don't matter at the time, but like these things add up eventually, and it leads to the fall of the whole entire civilization, to then be renamed Istanbul, as which we know today. That's what we know the city as. So, but so the Byzantiums had around 7,000 to 10,000 defenders, all knights with heavier armor and things like that, and Giovanni Gustiniani But Genoa, he was a Genoa, which is from Italy, and that's like some people did come, and obviously, I mean, a lot of these were mercenary troops, but they stayed and fought. They didn't switch sides, which is very honorable. I think that should be mentioned. And these guys were outnumbered 4 or 5, 10 to 1, but they were really hoping that their walls and normally any other time that would have been enough, but not for these cannons, these big cannons and things. And the other force, the Janissaries, which is what we're going to talk about, who they were and why that's very significant, and something we should all learn and take a second to think about the significance of what they were and how that happened. But so we're still talking about Byzantium. They had 7 to 10,000 troops with a Genoa commander who he's the one that kind of Giovanni Giustinian. He led the defense and um, he coordinated everything, and he was pretty much the commander of the Byzantium side. So, and they also had like small artillery, small cannons, nothing crazy. This is like the 1400s, very small cast iron cannons. And they turned down the services of Orban, who took it to Mehmed II, which we're going to talk about, the Seljuk Turks. Now, Mehmed II, uh, they had 50 to 80,000 troops. Those were pretty much split up into like three tiers of men. You had like, I think it was 20,000 irregulars, 20 to 30,000 irregulars, untrained men that were really there to just take the volleys and things. Because they had small firearms and things too. I apologize, small firearms and things like that at this time. It was the beginning of that. But so Mehmed with his 70,000, 20 to 30,000 were called irregulars. They were Christians too, pretty much forced to fight against these guys or paid to fight or for whatever reason they were there, but they were just cannon fodder. They were there to absorb the shots and everything like that. And then they had like another, it was like 15 to 20,000 um regular troops, regular militia that was trained and funded by the Sultan, or yeah, by Mehmed. I think he was a Sultan, very young Sultan. Mehmed was a very young commander at this time, and he's a commander in his own right. And I don't think just because I disagree with his religion and way of life that we can take away the brilliance of this commander. This guy Mehmed II is one of the most prominent commanders uh, for the Muslim side. He conquered damn near all of what used to be the Byzantium Empire. So very imposing figure of history that I think we should give our respect to. But so he had his 20,000 regulars, and then that gets us into the Janissaries. They had like 10,000, 5 to 10,000 Janissaries, and who these guys were, it's like almost crazy. So Janissaries were young men that were taken from Christian families. So when they were conquered and everything like that, mainly from the Balkans, they took their sons, they trained them to hate their faith, and then brought them back to tear down their heritage. That's what the Janissaries were. Young Christian men who were taken from their family, raised as Muslims, and like raised with religious fervor to destroy their enemies. And these guys made such a huge difference in the battle that it's arguable to say that they were the ones that caused it, but they certainly helped ensure the destruction of their heritage. So, and to speak in a way, it's very diabolical. And that's the type of enemies that you have in the world, that you really, luckily as we live and everything, we live in a very good time that things like that don't happen, that you would hope. But you have to be vigilant for things like that. That to me is a very sobering, like, holy shit. We can never be conquered, because that's the things you got to look forward to when you're conquered by a different religion like that. So yeah. So those are the two sides. Byzantium defenders, mercenary, 7 to 10,000. Seljuk Turks, 50 to 80,000. 20,000 irregulars, 15,000 regulars, 10,000 elite Janissaries that make all the difference. But those are the two sides. So let's get into it. We're going to start the siege. So April 4th, Mehmed surrounds the city, cuts everything, tries to cut everything off. But that, oh, sorry, it's part of the defenses of Byzantium. We had to back up. We had to back up. So part of the defenses of Byzantium is obviously they were on a peninsula and they were like here and there's water all around. So they had what they called the Golden Horn chain. They had like two things on each side where they could raise a chain up and make sure nobody goes past to get into their harbor. So Byzantium's here, you have the Bosphorus Strait and then their harbor. So they could pull a chain up right there so nobody could get into their harbor. So they had that. So that's part of their defenses. Very, and they bypass it. Very genius way to bypass it. We'll get into. But those are the two sides. So that's how we got here, and those are the two sides. I kind of noticed I've been recapping too much and kind of shoving it down everyone's throat, so we're not going to do that. I think I've explained it all very well up until now, where we're at and how we got here, and who the two sides are. So next, we are going to get into the siege. All right. So for this one, I'm probably going to look at my notes a little bit more because we're doing the siege begins and we're going to go by like date to date as significant things happen. And it only lasted a couple months, so it wasn't like a huge crazy ordeal. But we're going to go over each significant event as it happened, which brings us, like we said, April 4th to 6th, Mehmed shows up, sets up the siege, surrounds everything, and they pull their golden horn chain up, and they're surrounded. So that brings us to April 20th, where as they were surrounded, and as they were surrounded, a Venetian convoy of 4 ships. Oh man, fuck! I gotta back up. So part of the siege, which I mean, I guess I don't have to back up a lot because it's part of the siege is they set up cannons to shoot at the ships as they went by. That's got like duh, But they had boats there to block everybody, and on April 20th, 4 boats broke through the blockade and managed to dodge all these fucking cannonballs and everything like that and get into. They lower the horn, they lower the chain, they get in, they raise it back up. Yay, yippee, woo! Very good for the defenders. But boosted the morale. But and that brings us to 2 days later on April 22nd. Mehmed was pretty pissed off about this. He was going to have his commander or admiral executed who let this happen, but at the last second, all of the admiral's men were like, "No, he fought," and he was like injured and stuff, so he like got commuted to 40 lashes. But to make up for this, this like slight against Mehmed, they they took 70 ships up over land to bring them into the harbor to then fully siege them so they couldn't come out. So like as we were talking, you had the horn, so it's like this. They take the ships like up over land on the right side. And I'll show like if I can find the graphics for it. But they make ships and go up over land and bypass the Golden Horn pretty much, the chain, so then the guys can't come out into their harbor and make escape attempts and everything like that. So then they at this point they like are fully truly encircled and they're in the harbor. They can't come out of their harbor. They're dockings. So that was April 22nd. They used grease logs to push these ships and teams of oxen and men to pull 70 ships up a hill and down the other side into the water to bypass the Golden Horn's big chains. Which brings us to April 28th, which was kind of like a sortie. That's it was a failed Byzantine sortie that they used fire ships. They came out and tried to attack, and then they used fire ships, and they got a couple of them, but overall it was a failure. It did not push the blockade off or anything. It's kind of like a sortie. They tried, they failed. Unfortunate. And then that brings us, so we're at April 28th into early May. at this point, everybody. So, and the thing about sieges is they got dirty quick. Nobody had latrines. It wasn't like we have today with modern understandings of everything. So when you had a siege, the longer it would go on, the more disease the people would get, more people would start dropping and dying from disease. So as the siege went on, as we're going through April, everybody's morale is getting lowered and lowered and lowered and lowered. But May 21st, Mehmed, we're kind of jumping ahead here. We're at the end of April, and then we're jumping right to May. There were little assaults. He would send probing assaults, maybe every day, every couple days. Nothing broke through. They would use the cannons to, shoot and break down the walls, and but they would rebuild them at night. So it's kind of like a game of knock it down, get it built back up. But obviously, as it gets more and more damaged, the things get bigger and bigger, and the harder it is to build and build. So as this is going on, people are dying from disease. It's getting shitty out. Everybody's morale is low. But on May 21st, Mehmed offers another unconditional surrender. Says that he'll let everybody leave that wants to leave, won't kill everybody. He just wants to be the ruling party and take everyone over. But obviously, this is denied. They will not do it. They're like, I think the quote is that we are all here of our free will. And I think the emperor was like, well, if anybody here wants to leave, go. We're not stopping you. And credit where credit's due. They stood and fought to the end. And I think every guy should have fantasies about that, about staying and defending, till the last man and not giving up. Very valorous things that I think any man would want to be a part of. I guess thank God we don't have to. But I mean that's what these guys are fighting for. Their religion, their right, and very very. I think that's what when we're talking about this story, that's something that really needs to be respected and talked about is the devotion of these men, these 7 to 10,000 men they were of different religious beliefs as far as Protestant and Catholics, but they still came together to fight off the Muslim invaders. And as we'll talk, one of the next more significant events is right before the finals. So I wrote my notes wrong, unfortunately. But on May 2nd, and this is something I really haven't heard talked about a lot, but I think it's really significant because if you were there, you'd be like, holy shit. So during this time, when this was all going on, during May, you had a lot of lunar like you had a partial lunar eclipse. There was a meteor that went by. There was all right. So we checked, and there was a partial lunar eclipse and a comet that shot by, and these were terrifying omens. Which if you're during a siege, whenever everything is going to shit, then there's a fucking lunar eclipse where the moon covers the sun the moon covers the sun for a couple seconds. I would take that as an omen of we are probably fucked too. And what happened. So it really was an omen, but that's significant. I think that's it's not something we talked about. That happened May 2nd. Then you had May 21st. He offered the surrender. It was refused. And like I said, around this time, I think it's like May 22nd, something like that. Everybody's morale is low and everything like this. Mehmed calls a council, and his top leadership, the older ones that were not the Janissaries generals, were saying to call it off, actually. And it's very, very interesting how much this went into the actual fall because his generals were trying to convince him to call it off. They were like, "Oh, a fleet has to be here any day from the church. We have to call it off. They're gonna kill us all. We can't do this." And his janissary captains were like, "No, we're doing this. We're here. We're doing it." And they convinced him to keep the siege on. So that's like another level to this is that like your kids literally destroyed your heritage. Oh my god, man. Very, very unfortunate. And that leads us into May 29th, the final assault, which before that is May 28th, if you didn't know. But, so, yeah, May 29th is the final assault, but on May 28th was a day of silence and prayers and fasting for both sides, which it said that the defenders thought it was very eerie that there was no sound coming from the camp of the attackers. But at this time was uh, the final religious service, Christian religious service held in the Hagia Sophia by both Catholicism, by both Catholics and Protestants. The schism was well on at this point, and these people put aside their differences, and they both had the final mass together, and they both marched in the street together, pretty much ready to face the end. Very very sad. You know, Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia. It gets turned into a fucking mosque, but you know, that brings us to the 29th, the final assault, where so the final assault was on May 29th after the day of fasting and silence, and it started at 1 a.m. around midnight. So right as soon as it was the first, so there were three waves of assaults. The first one was at midnight, and they sent the irregulars to pretty much absorb all the shot and everything that can be used against them because they're the cannon fodder Christians that nobody gives a fuck about. um, you know, followed by in the morning, in the like 5 a.m., they send in the regulars to then hit the beleaguered troops and really kind of kind of exhaust them to nothing. Which they were fighting was a very valiant fight until the commander Giovanni Gastini is shot and killed. And it's like during this whole time, all of these attacks are they're fighting them off and they're rebuilding and everything and the hope's okay. We're gonna make it. Any day there's gonna be a fleet, guys. Just hold on one more day. And then the leader gets shot, Giovanni Gastiani, and he goes down. And that's the breaking point as he's carried away and everything, and his troops. It's like the whole entire line starts to break and everything. And then at this time, also the final assault, the Janissaries, the elite guard, ready to do, held back in reserve this whole time, so they're extremely fresh. They're sent to fight what's left of the exhausted, beleaguered defenders. And as you can imagine, it was a slaughter, which we're going to talk about next. That's going to be the next section is the fall and sacking of Constantinople. Very sad, but L's in the chat, boys. L's in the chat. They're it leads to some legends too later about how one day somebody might rise up and reconquer Constantinople. Who knows? You know, well, iconography is evil and everything like that. But if you like, and I think there's still beautiful churches and everything because he didn't, you know, Mehmed was a very like he was a very nice ruler, you know. Besides all this shit, it's like Muslims were the best, but he didn't shit on, and he didn't fucking persecute and massacre them, but he turned the biggest church into a fucking mosque. So how great's that? And he renamed it the city, like Great Conqueror, Byzantium, fire. Awesome. Let's name it Istanbul. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I can I jest a little bit, a little bit. There's a little bit of jest in there. There's some truth in there too. But it's like, well, yeah, I'm not fat, not a shape. So, all right, let's get into it. And as we were talking about, once Giovanni Gastiani was hit and mortally wounded and taken away, the little line starts to collapse. The emperor that was the emperor for this time, Diogenes. Oh my god, why can't I figure that out? Dude, it's on the tip of my. All right, where is he? He was last seen charging into battle. Very like cinematic thing. He didn't surrender. He took off his emperor's gown and armor and charged into battle as a lowly knight or whatever. And there is a legend that he was saved at the last second, and he is a marble statue underneath the Golden Gate, which is one of the gates that come into Constantinople. He's in a cave under there, and one day he's gonna rise up and take back the city. No, probably not. But that's the legend anyway. But okay, now we're gonna go into. All right, so the sacking and fall of Constantinople. obviously. There was holes blown into it and everything. I mean, at this time, it's a fucking shit show. They storm the city, they kill it, they kill everybody, they enslave 50,000 people. There's a quote from the Venetian surgeon Niccolo Borbero who said the blood flowed like rainwater in the gutters. That was how bad the massacre was. And this went on for like 3 days, I think. But and this is a credit to where Mehmed he comes into the city, and after that he stops it. They were gonna destroy the churches and everything, and he says, I think a quote is, "I what a beautiful city we have brought to plunder," and he's kind of like taken aback by how beautiful the city is, which he should be because it's a fucking beautiful city. But he stops it, so he stops the destruction of the churches and and stops the pillage and everything. But everybody that was taken up at that point was still sold into slavery and everything like that. So not the greatest, but and as a leader, you know, as a leader, he did some very significant things. I don't want to shit on the guy completely because he did leave religious autonomy to the different religious sects, but they still had to pay the jizya tax if they didn't convert. But he did let each religious community, he restored the ecclesiastic patriarch for the Orthodox organization, and then he did the same thing for an Armenian organization. So he did let these guys have a lot of autonomous rule, but it was like, hey, you still know who the king is. But as far as a leader, he didn't persecute them like everywhere else. Very, So Mehmed II, we have to give credit where credit's due. Very formidable leader. And then after he conquered, he was very considerable and did not just kill everybody and make them all convert. He kept the churches, the Orthodox and the Catholics. He brought back their organizations, and he named new deacons and everything like that, which like he named them, but I guess you take what you get when you're conquered people. But that is the fall of Constantinople. Very somber, very solemn, very unfortunate. It's still known as Istanbul to this day. Obviously, it's part of Turkey, as it's the capital city of Turkey, which is a NATO member. And it's funny. It's like they still don't go to Jerusalem and see if you get spit on if you're a Christian, but go to Istanbul and see if you get spit on. You won't. But if you go to Jerusalem, where our greatest ally is, you will. Only the kids will spit on you, though, so there's that. Like they don't fucking hate you. But if you're watching this far along, I try not to bring politics into it, but I mean, I'm Catholic, and that's a thing. Whatever. If you don't like it, don't fucking watch it, I guess. I don't know. But that's the video for today, guys. Thank you. If you made it this far, like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.